Hey everybody, it's Miss Elizabeth here again with Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH by Robert C. O'Brien, illustrated by Zena Bernstein, published by Athenaeum Books for Young Readers, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster Children's Publishing Division. So, we have been reading this book for our bedtimes, and I hope you guys have been enjoying that. And today we are going to continue on to chapter 24. We are super close to the end of this book, so close, and things have gotten very, very exciting. So, if you remember from yesterday where we left off, Mrs. Frisby got captured by the Fitzgibbons' son Billy and put in a cage when she was putting the medicine to make Dragon go to sleep into his food. And she heard an interesting discussion between the Fitzgibbons about an exterminator slash probably the doctor from NIMH coming to get rid of the rats. So things are getting crazy. So we're going to start up again on chapter 24, Escape. At 10 by the kitchen clock, the Fitzgibbons went to bed. Dragon was put out, the doors locked, the lights turned off. The first of these things was done by Billy, on instruction from his mother, not without some difficulty. He opened the door. "Come on, Dragon, out." "He won't get up." "I never saw such a lazy cat. He gets worse every day." Finally, Dragon, protesting with only the sleepiest of whines, was picked up and deposited on the back porch. He scarcely opened his eyes. By that time it was dark. Mrs. Frisby waited a few minutes until she was sure they were really gone and until her eyes adjusted so she could see the bars of her cage. They were vertical bars, smooth and no thicker than matchsticks, which made them slippery to climb, but by turning more or less sideways she was able to grip them fairly well. She inched her way up to the sliding door and tried to lift it. She could tell from the first pull that it was no use. The door was stiff and it was heavy, and she could not get a good enough grip on either it or the cage wall to exert much pressure. Still she kept trying, first lifting on the middle of the door, then on one corner, then another, straining every muscle. In half an hour she admitted defeat, at least for the moment, and climbed back down to the bottom of the cage. She sat there, shaking from the effort, and thought. Somehow she had to get out. Her children even now would be alone in the dark house, alone at night for the first time. Martin and Teresa would be trying to reassure the younger ones, yet they themselves would be sadly frightened. What would they think? Since she had not told them about Dragon and the sleeping powder, she hoped that perhaps they would decide she had, for some reason, stayed with the rats. But at 11, which could not be far off, she could not read the kitchen clock in the dark. The rats would arrive to move the house. Or would they, knowing, since Justin must have told them, that she had not come out of the kitchen? She thought they would. She hoped they would, and that Justin would go with them and talk to the children and try to calm their fear. There was something about Justin, a kind of easy confidence, that would help them. She no longer had any doubt, of course, that the rats could move her house. It was a generous thing to do, especially at a time when they were hurrying so in their plan, their own move. And they had no idea yet of how little time they really had, of the new danger that crowded upon them. If she could only get out, she would run and warn them, and it might still not be too late. She thought, it's a good plan and a brave one. It would be the first time in all the world that intelligent beings, besides men, had ever tried to start a real civilization of their own. They ought to have a chance. It was not right that they should be killed at the last minute, or captured. Could it be that they, the men who were coming, were somehow connected with NIMH? Or was it more likely, as Paul had guessed, that they were only worried about rabies? She decided it didn't really matter. The result would be the same. The day after next, the truck would come with its poison gas, and that would be the end of their plans, unless they could be warned. Wearily, she got up to climb the wall and try the door again. She heard a noise. It was in the kitchen near her cage, a small scuffling on the hard linoleum floor. Now what kind of a bird can that be with no wings? It was Justin's voice, very soft, and he was laughing. "Justin! I thought you might like to come home. Your children are asking after you. Are they all right?" "They're fine. They were worried, but I told them I'd bring you back. They seem to believe me. But how did you know that you were here? You forgot. I was waiting just under the cabinet. I heard what happened. I felt like biting Billy full of holes. But as soon as I heard that you were safely in the cage, I went and told the children you were all right, but that you'd be a little late. I didn't tell them exactly why. Now let's get you out. I tried. I couldn't open the door. I'll get it open. I brought along a few tools. Burglar's tools, you might say, in my backpack. Should I climb up the stand? No, it looks slippery. I think I'll try the curtain. And in a matter of seconds, Justin had swarmed up a window curtain a foot away, and she heard a thump as he leaped and landed on top of the cage, which swayed under the impact. The noise was slight, but they both listened intently for a moment to see if it produced another from upstairs. All quiet. Now let me look at that door. Justin climbed easily down the side of the cage. Oh, I hope you can get it open. I can, Justin said, examining it. Easily enough, but I don't think I will. Why not? Why not? Because you couldn't, Justin said, and they'll know that. So they won't be curious. Let's make it open itself. As I expected, it doesn't have real hinges. He had pulled a small metal bar out of his backpack and was working as he talked. Just little wire rings, dime store quality, cheap, flimsy things. They're always coming apart. As he said that, one of them came apart. The door sagged and hung crazily by one corner. There, you see? You couldn't help it if they put you in a defective cage. Come on out. Mrs. Frisby climbed through and stood with Justin on the top of the cage. Now, he said, we shimmy down the stand like a fireman's pole. You go out the way you came in, under the cabinet and through the hole. I'll go out the way I came in, through the attic. I'll meet you outside. Justin, said Mrs. Frisby, there's something I've got to tell you, something I learned. Wait till we're out, said Justin. We've got to hurry. You see, we're having a little trouble moving your cinder block. He was off, running silently into the front of the house, from which the stairway led up 2 flights to the attic. Mrs. Frisby crawled under the cabinet, searched in total darkness for the small hole, and finally felt one foot slip down. She dropped through. The square opening in the foundation was easier to find. It glowed palely ahead of her, lit with moonlight. Justin was waiting for her as she came out of the corner of the screen. The night was warm, and a half-moon shone on the farmyard. Now, he said, what was it you wanted to tell me? He spoke seriously. He had heard the urgency in her voice. They hurried toward the garden, rounding the back porch. There, a dark heap in the moonlight, lay Dragon. No threat to anyone tonight. Some exterminators are coming to poison all of you, Mrs. Frisby told him, as briefly as she could of the conversation she had heard at the Fitzgibbons' dinner table. 7 rats, Justin said. Rabies. It might be, but I'll bet it was Jenner. When are the men supposed to come? The day after tomorrow. To her surprise, Justin stopped. He looked at her in admiration. You know, he said, I had a feeling the first time I clapped eyes on you that you'd bring us good luck. Good luck? She was amazed. Oh, it's bad news. It's serious. We'll have to change our plans and quickly. But think how much worse it would be if you hadn't overheard it. We wouldn't have had a chance. They came into the garden. Is Nicodemus here? Mrs. Frisby asked. No, in a few minutes I'll go and tell him. But first we need your help to get started moving your house. My help? What can I do? You can talk to your neighbor. She seems to think we're stealing your cinder block. She bit Arthur in the leg. At one end of the big stone in the middle of the garden, 10 rats were digging briskly, using scoops that looked more like teaspoons than shovels, piling the earth neatly beside a hole already almost big enough to hold Mrs. Frisby's house. But on the other side of the stone there was an impasse. Here another 10 rats stood, baffled, in a semicircle. Behind them they had deposited a jumble of equipment. Odd-shaped metal bars, pulleys, wooden structures that looked like ladders, other pieces of wood that resembled small logs. But between the rats and Mrs. Frisby's front door stood a small, defiant figure. The rats, looking enormous by comparison, remained a respectful distance away from her. Why, said Mrs. Frisby to Justin, it's the shrew. Yes, said Justin, and acting shrewish. One of the rats was speaking. Mrs. Frisby recognized Arthur. But I told you, ma'am, we do have Mrs. Frisby's permission. She wants us to move her house. Ask the children. Call them out. Don't tell me that! What have you done with Mrs. Frisby? It's a good thing the children haven't heard you. They'd be frightened half to death. If Mrs. Frisby wanted you to move her house, she'd be here. It's all right, called Mrs. Frisby, running forward. I'm here. Mrs. Frisby, said the shrew, you're just in time. I heard a noise and came out and found these creatures trying to dig up your house. I tried to explain it to her, said Arthur, but she won't believe me. I certainly won't, said the shrew. He said you asked him to dig up your house. Thieving rats. It's true, Mrs. Frisby said. I did ask them, and they said they would. It's very kind of them. Kind? Said the shrew. Great hulking beasts, what do you mean? It took several more minutes of reassurance by Mrs. Frisby before the shrew grudgingly moved aside, still muttering warnings. I wouldn't trust them. How do you know they'll do what they say? That, of course, Mrs. Frisby could not explain to her. The rats now commenced to dig busily at the dirt on top of and around Mrs. Frisby's cinder block. Justin said, I've got to go and talk to Nicodemus. You'd better get the children out. Mrs. Frisby hurried into her house. She found them waiting in the living room, unaware of the small crisis that had been taking place outside. As Justin had said, they did not seem worried. We were scared at first, Teresa said, but then one of the rats came to see us. He couldn't come in, but he called to us, and we came out, Martin and I. He said his name was Justin. Have you met him? He's very nice. I've met him, said Mrs. Frisby. Now we'd better go outside. They're getting ready to move the house. I'm ready, said Timothy. I'm all wrapped up like a scarecrow. Martin and Teresa had taken pieces of warm cloth from the bed and tied them around him. Mrs. Frisby could not see him in the dark, but when she touched him, she found they had even tied a piece like a bonnet around his head and ears. Good, she said, and we're lucky. It's a warm night and dry. They went up the small tunnel to the garden and watched in the moonlight from a hillock a few feet away. The rats had finished digging the new hole, and all 20 of them were working near the house. It was a sight to see. As soon as the earth had been cleared from the top and sides of the cinder block so that it lay fully exposed in its hole, all of the rats turned to the pile of equipment. Under Arthur's direction, the ladder-like structures became a scaffolding, 4 small towers standing one near each corner of the block. Across the tops of these the rats fastened strong, light bars of metal, probably, Mrs. Frisby thought, from the toy tinker's truck. From these bars they now hung pulleys wound with strong, thin cord, and at the ends of the cord they fastened hooks, which they slipped into the oval-shaped holes in the block and pulled taut. 5 strong rats stood by each cord. One of them, Mrs. Frisby noticed, was bigger than the rest. Her friend Brutus. Heave! Called Arthur. The 20 rats strained on the cords, and the block rose an inch. Each rat stepped back a pace. Heave! Another inch. Slowly, the heavy block rose from the hole until it hung 2 inches above level ground. Steady, said Arthur. Get the rollers. 8 rats, 2 from each group, ran to the round pieces of wood Mrs. Frisby had noticed earlier. These resembled sawed-up pieces of broom handle, each about a foot long. 2 rats to a roller, they slipped 4 of these under the cinder block so that they lay athwart the hole, like bars across a window. Lower away, said Arthur, and the cinder block came to rest gently on the rollers. Let's see how it rolls. They slipped the ropes free of the pulleys and rehooked 2 of them to the front of the block. 9 rats now manned each rope. 2 stayed behind, watching the rollers. Heave! The rollers turned, and the heavy block slid forward easily, like a truck on wheels, in the direction of the new hole. When it moved off the hindmost of the rollers, as it did every few inches, the 2 rats in the rear would pick that one up and replace it under the front of the block. Almost like a game of leapfrog, Mrs. Frisby thought, but a well-rehearsed game. The rats had planned carefully. They knew exactly what they were doing. They moved with precision and never wasted a motion. Within a very few minutes, the first of the rollers lay across the new hole, then the second, and finally all 4. The block was poised and in position. The hole was exactly the right size and shape. The rats had even dug out a new pantry hole in one corner and carved out the small tunnel that would connect the 2 rooms of the house. The towers and the pulleys were put up again, and the whole process of lifting and lowering was done in reverse. The rollers were pulled away, and the block was eased slowly down into its new home. "It's done!" cried Mrs. Frisby. She felt like applauding. "Not quite yet," said Arthur over his shoulder. To the other rats he said, "Get the shovels and the backpacks." Pausing a moment to rest, he explained to Miss Frisby, "We're going to cover it with turf, and then we've got to fill up the old hole with the dirt from the new one, or Mr. Fitzgibbon will wonder who's been digging up his garden. Also, we've still to dig you an entrance hole." In her excitement, Mrs. Frisby had forgotten this small detail. She could not get into her house. Now she watched in awe as Arthur and Brutus, using two small, sharp, long-handled shovels, dug the narrow tunnel down to her living room. It took them somewhat less than 5 minutes. It had taken her all day to dig the other one. "Now," said Arthur, "you can put your children to bed. We'll take care of the rest." Yay! What's that? All right. One more chapter for tonight. That was kind of a long one, so I was making sure I hadn't lost track of time there. So this next chapter is called At the Meeting. Mrs. Frisby slept well and soundly. The day just finished having been the longest and hardest she had ever known. She awoke in the morning with a smile. Her house was warm and it was safe at last. Her children slept peacefully beside her. Timothy's breathing was quiet and easy. They could stay in the house now as long as they needed to. On some warm day later in the spring, when Timothy was strong again, they would move to the summer house down by the brook. Another nice thing, she thought, when they left the house, she would close up the entrance tunnel so that no one could find it. Undisturbed by the plow, it would be ready and waiting for them in the fall. It could be theirs forever, thanks to the rats. The rats! In her half-dreaming state, she had forgotten. They were in terrible danger. What would they do? She felt as if she ought to go and offer to help them, but help how? She could think of nothing she could do. At that moment, she heard a voice calling her name from above. "Mrs. Frisby!" She left the bed and went to the bottom of the entrance hole. "Yes? Who's calling?" "It's me, Brutus. Can you come up?" Mrs. Frisby climbed up and out her front door, blinking in the early morning sunlight. "Nicodemus wants to know if you can come with me. He's having a meeting. Just let me wake the children and tell them." 2 minutes later, she was walking with Brutus towards the rose bush. "What does Nicodemus want?" "It's about the men. Justin told us last night. Nicodemus thinks they may be from NIMH. He wants to ask you more about what Mr. Fitzgibbon said." That morning there were 2 rats on sentry duty, one just inside the entrance to the rose bush, watching Mr. Fitzgibbon's house, another at the arch where Brutus had stood. All of the rest were gathered in the large assembly room. Mrs. Frisby had seen when she got off the elevator. Nicodemus, Justin, Arthur, and 2 other rats sat on the raised platform at the end. The rest sat facing them, filling every square inch of floor space except for an aisle up the center. Mrs. Frisby had never seen so many rats. Even the young ones were present. She spotted Isabella staring up at the platform with wide, round eyes. Some of the mothers held small babies at their side. Most of them looked anxious. There was an air of tension, but none of panic. Brutus led her up the center aisle to the raised platform. There was a table on it covered with papers, and one vacant space where a chair had been placed for Mrs. Frisby. The rats waited in complete silence while she sat down. Then Nicodemus said, quite formally, "Justin has told us all that happened. Mrs. Frisby, it seems you have more than repaid us for the help we gave you in moving your house. Just as your husband did once, you have saved us from a disaster, death or capture. We do not yet know which." Justin gave her a wink. Mrs. Frisby had a taste of capture herself last night. "Would you tell us, as well as you can remember it, word for word, what Mr. Fitzgibbon said about the rats, about the men who were at the store?" "As well as I can remember it," Mrs. Frisby's voice sounded small in the big room. "Mr. Fitzgibbon said a strange thing had happened in the hardware store. Henderson's, he called it." Her memory was good. She had listened with great care to what Mr. Fitzgibbon had said, and she was able to recall the whole conversation word for word. The rats sat quietly while she told it. Then Nicodemus went back over it, asking questions. "You say that Mr. Fitzgibbon said 6 or 7 rats. Did he ever say which number it really was?" "No, I don't think he paid much attention to the number." "Jenner's group was 7, said Justin, "but it could be a coincidence." "Did he say how far away the town was where this happened, or did he name it?" "No, but it must not be very far. He'd been there and back that day." "Did anyone see his car go out?" Nicodemus asked the others. "I heard it," Brutus said. "I was on duty. It went after lunch." "And he was back by dinner. But which direction? If we knew, we might send someone, you see, Nicodemus explained to Mrs. Frisby. We need to know who those men are. If they're from NIMH, things are much worse for us. We'd never make it, said Arthur. Driving at, say, 40 or 50 miles an hour, Mr. Fitzgibbon might have gone 15 or 20 miles in any direction and returned easily the same afternoon. On the map, there was a road map on the table, you can see it could have been any one of half a dozen small towns, and each of them might have a hardware store. You're right, of course, said Nicodemus. Without the name, that idea is hopeless. He turned back to Mrs. Frisby. Mr. Fitzgibbon said the rats were grouped around the motor as if they were trying to move it. That's what he said the store owner told him. He didn't see it himself. And that the motor was plugged in. Had been left plugged in, Mrs. Frisby quoted. But we don't know who plugged it in. I got the impression, Mrs. Frisby said, from the way he said it, that the store owner had left it plugged in. But I'm not sure. That would make sense, Arthur said. If it was Jenner, and if they had plugged it in themselves, they'd have known better than to try to move it. So they must not have realized. It was probably pretty dark in the store. Poor Jenner, said Nicodemus. I wish he had stayed with us. It will be poor us, said one of the rats at the table. Mrs. Frisby didn't know his name. If we don't get on with this. He did not mention the doctor's name, Nicodemus said. Did he say even a word about what he looked like? No. Did he describe the truck at all? No, only that it was full of equipment. Are you sure about the headline in the local paper? Mechanized rats invade hardware store? I'm sure that's what Mr. Fitzgibbon said it was, but I don't think he saw it. He didn't say so. In a way, that's the most puzzling thing about the whole story, Nicodemus said. Why is that? Asked Justin. Because the headline doesn't really fit the facts. You don't call a bunch of dead rats mechanized just because you find them on a shelf near a motor. Maybe not, said the nameless rat, but then why did that newspaper say it? I'm wondering, Nicodemus said, if perhaps there wasn't more to the story. Some stronger reason to think they were really taking the motor away, or that they knew how to use it. Maybe some other motors had been stolen, Justin said, or some tools that would make them seem mechanized. It would, said Nicodemus, and it would explain what the doctor meant when he said they had more checking to do in town. They're looking for the things that were missing, Arthur said, sounding suddenly worried. They're looking for Jenner's headquarters, and if they find it... We're just guessing, of course, Nicodemus said, but it's a possibility. And a bad one. It means, Nicodemus continued, that we have no choice. We've got to assume they're from NIMH. We've also got to assume that by now they may have found Jenner's headquarters, whatever cave or cavern they were using. And, said Justin, that they're now looking for us. Why for us? Asked one of the rats. Why wouldn't they think Jenner's group are the only ones? They might, Nicodemus admitted, but I don't think so. After all, they know that there were 20 of us originally. Why should there be only 7 now? And we already know that they're coming out here, in quite a hurry at that. So if they're from NIMH, obviously they are looking for us. I think, said Arthur, that we've got to make some plans, and quickly. I agree, said Nicodemus. It's a new situation, and a tricky one. We won't be able to do everything we hope to. There isn't time. And somehow we have to convince the exterminators when they come that we aren't more of the mechanized rats they're looking for. We won't be able to move any more food to Thorn Valley, Nicodemus continued. We'll have to get along with what we've already got stored there, about an 18-month supply if we're careful. The seeds, I believe, are already moved. Yes, said Arthur, the last load went yesterday. So with luck, we'll have our own first crops this summer and fall. We won't have time to destroy the motors, or the books, or the furniture as we planned. Instead, we'll move everything to the cave, and then we'll seal off all entrances to the cave as if it had never existed. That can be done, Arthur said, but there's more. We've got to pull all the wires and lights from the tunnel. They're likely to dig it up, and the carpet. We've got to tear down the arch. Then when all that's done, when everything is hidden in the cave, we'll fill in the stairway and the elevator shaft. We'll seal off everything except the upper storage room and the tunnels leading in the front and out the back. When they dig, let them find that room. It's as big as an ordinary rat hole. Justin, tonight, take a group of a dozen or so. Go to the Fitzgibbons garbage can. Bring back a load of the worst-smelling garbage you can find. The storage room is going to become an ordinary, typical rat hole, not in the least mechanized or civilized. Nicodemus turned to Arthur. What do you think? I think we can do it all. We won't get much sleep, though, Justin said. But there's one more thing. Won't they think it's odd, especially if they're from NIMH, finding just an empty hole? Nicodemus said, I was coming to that. He sounded suddenly very tired. Tomorrow morning, as soon as it's light, the main group leaves for Thorn Valley, but some of us will have to stay behind. As Justin says, if they find just an empty hole, they're sure to be suspicious, and they'll keep on digging. So when they come with their gas truck, they've got to find some rats here, a rear guard. I'd say at least 10. Mrs. Frisby walked slowly home, keeping to the edge of the woods, keeping out of sight. Justin had instantly volunteered for the rear guard. Brutus was second, and behind him 8 more. There were 50 more waiting behind them. Enough, enough, said Nicodemus. Isabella, in tears, had run forward. I want to stay, please, she had pleaded, looking despairingly at Justin. No children, said Nicodemus, and her mother led her away, still weeping. Those 10, the 10 who would remain, did not face certain death nor certain capture. The exterminators, they presumed, would make noise, especially if they cleared away the rosebush. The rats would be alerted. When the men pumped gas, as expected, into the hole, the pump would also make a noise. The air below would move as the gas flowed in. When they felt that, the rats would scramble out the back exit, pass the sealed-off cave, emerge as noisily as possible in the blackberry bramble, indeed show themselves, and dash off into the woods. But won't they block the rear exit, or put a net over it? We'll give them another rear exit to block, Arthur had said cryptically, one that's easier to find. Mother, why are you so quiet? Asked Teresa. They were sitting down to dinner for the first time in their newly moved house. You seem sad. I suppose I am, Mrs. Frisby said, because the rats are all going away. But that's no reason. It's true they moved our house, and that was nice of them, but we didn't really know them. I was getting to know them pretty well. Where are they going? Cynthia asked. To a new home a long way away. When? Tomorrow morning. Will you go to see them off? I think I will. But why are they moving away? Asked Timothy. Because they want to, said Mrs. Frisby. Someday soon she would tell them the whole story, but not that night. All right, getting really close to the end. I hope you guys have enjoyed this session of bedtime stories. And of course, as always, I will pick back up tomorrow. And I think tomorrow might be the end of it, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. Let us check. Yep. Tomorrow's the last one. So join us if you want to hear the conclusion of this story, and hopefully I will see you guys all then, and I hope you have a good night, and I will be back. Bye.